They threw me out with a cardboard box and a hollow "good luck" 5 years later, after I'd paid off my mortgage. They stood on my porch, smirking. "We're here for the family property." What they don't know is this house was theirs, and I bought it at a foreclosure auction from the very people they conspired with. Tonight, I'm opening the door not to surrender it, but to seal their every exit. My name is Nora Vale, and I was 28 years old when my world dissolved into the gray, sterile carpet of an HR conference room. The termination from Halcyon Metrics wasn't a bang, but a whimper. It was a line item in a quarterly report, a strategic realignment, a synergy-focused workforce reduction. The words were meaningless, sanitized jargon designed to mask the simple, brutal fact. I was no longer useful. They gave me a standardized severance packet, a professionally sympathetic smile that didn't reach the eyes, and a cardboard box that smelled faintly of industrial glue. The walk from my cubicle to the elevator was the longest of my life, a gauntlet of averted gazes and the quiet tapping of keyboards that seemed to get louder with every step I took. By the time the glass doors slid shut, sealing me off from the life I'd meticulously built, the first wave of cold had already begun to set in. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was a hollow, ringing silence where my future used to be. My only option was Graybridge, a town that existed in a perpetual state of overcast skies and quiet judgment. It was where my mother's sister had married Roy Vale, a man whose spine was made of brittle pride and whose kindness was purely transactional. Their house on Willow Street was the only place I had left to go. The drive there was a blur of highway hypnosis and the mounting dread of having to ask for help. When I arrived, my aunt offered a thin-lipped welcome while my uncle, Roy, sized up the single cardboard box I carried as if it were a contagious disease. "Just until you're back on your feet," he said. The words clipped and devoid of warmth. I was a problem to be managed, a temporary inconvenience. I spent the first 2 weeks locked in the guest room, a floral wallpapered cage, applying for hundreds of jobs online. The silence from the rest of the house was a constant pressure. Meals were quiet, tense affairs. My presence was a drain on their resources, a disruption to their carefully curated suburban peace. I was a failure sleeping under their roof, breathing their air. The phrase burden was never spoken aloud in English, but I heard it in every sigh from my aunt, in every pointed question from Roy about my prospects, a burden. The end came before dawn on a Tuesday, 2.5 weeks after I'd lost my job. I was woken not by an alarm, but by the low, guttural rumble of a diesel engine outside my window. Peering through the blinds, I saw the blocky silhouette of a moving truck, its logo barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. Then came the sharp, authoritative rap on my door. It was Roy. He didn't enter. He just spoke through the wood, his voice flat and final. "We've decided it's best for you to have a fresh start. Nora, the movers are here to help you with your things." It wasn't a discussion. It was a verdict. 2 men I'd never seen before, their faces impassive, were already in the hallway. They worked with a detached efficiency, packing my meager belongings from the guest room into boxes they'd brought themselves. It took them less than 15 minutes. They treated my life like a minor logistical challenge. I stood on the porch, shivering in the damp morning air, wearing the same sweatshirt and jeans I'd slept in. The movers carried out the last box. It was overfilled, balanced precariously. As one of them navigated the porch steps, the box tipped. A single object tumbled out and hit the concrete walkway with a sharp, shattering sound. It was my framed graduation picture, the one of me beaming, cap askew, diploma in hand, the physical proof of a promise I had made to myself. The glass had splintered into a spiderweb of cracks across my own smiling face. One of the movers grunted a half-hearted apology. I just stared at the wreckage, the image of a hopeful girl, now broken on the cold ground. I felt a strange detachment, an icy clarity. I made a conscious decision not to bend down, not to salvage the pieces. That girl was gone. I left her there. Roy came out onto the porch, zipping up a fleece jacket against the chill. He didn't look at the broken frame. He didn't look at me. He looked at the truck, as if calculating the cost of the service. He pulled the front door closed behind him, the latch catching softly. "When you've got a paycheck again, call," he said. It wasn't an offer. It was a condition for re-entry into his world. My worth was a number on a pay stub. Without it, I was nothing. Then he stepped back inside. I heard the distinct, metallic sound of the deadbolt sliding into place. The finality of that click echoed in the hollow space inside my chest. It was the sound of being locked out, not just from a house, but from the very idea of family. The moving truck's engine coughed to life, its headlights cutting through the last of the darkness as it pulled away from the curb, taking the last fragments of my old life with it. I didn't know where to go. I got into my 10-year-old Honda Civic, the only significant asset to my name, and drove to the end of the block. I parked under the shadow of a large oak tree and killed the engine. From there, I could still see the house. I watched as the lights came on, one by one, a warm, yellow glow that felt a million miles away. I imagined them inside, my aunt making coffee, my cousin Lila getting ready for school, Roy reading the paper. Were they relieved? Did they feel a single pang of guilt? I leaned my head back against the cold vinyl of the headrest and closed my eyes. And then I heard it, or perhaps I imagined it, carried on the morning air, the faint sound of laughter, a snicker. It burrowed into my ear, sharp and cruel. I memorized the sound. I memorized the feeling of the cold seeping through the car door into my bones. I would not forget it. I slept there, cramped and freezing, as the sun came up over Graybridge. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat around noon. It was a text message. The screen cast a sterile blue light in the car's dim interior. It was from my cousin, Lila. I felt a foolish flicker of hope that she was checking on me, that she was horrified by what her parents had done. The message extinguished that hope with brutal efficiency. "Don't come back. The family lawyer says you owe back rent." The words were so cold, so clinical. The family lawyer, back rent. It was a declaration of war. They weren't just kicking me out. They were trying to erase me, to legally sever any claim I might have had to their pity or their conscience. They were building a wall of legal threats to keep me out for good. The betrayal from Lila, someone I'd grown up with, someone I'd shared childhood secrets with, cut deeper than the deadbolt. I started the car. The engine whined in protest against the cold. I didn't look at the house again. I pulled away from the curb and drove slowly down Willow Street, a street lined with manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. No curtains twitched. No one came to their door. No one waved. It was as if a ghost were passing through, unseen and unheard. My entire existence had been erased from this place in a matter of hours. As I drove, a single sentence began to form in my mind, hardening from a vague feeling into a solid, unbreakable creed. It repeated over and over, a silent mantra against the hum of the engine. I will not beg. I would not call. I would not ask for forgiveness. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. At the intersection, I glanced in the rearview mirror for the last time. The house on Willow Street was shrinking in the distance, its neat, symmetrical facade looking more sinister than welcoming. It wasn't a home I was leaving behind. It was a trap, and the jaws had just sprung shut behind me. I had escaped, but I was wounded, bleeding out into the cold upholstery of my car. I drove until the gaslight came on, pulling into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner. I bought a coffee with the loose change in my cup holder and sat in the car, the warmth of the cup doing little to fight the chill that had settled deep in my marrow. The world felt vast and indifferent, but amidst the desolation, there was a flicker of something else. Resolve. A cold, hard ember of purpose began to glow in the wreckage. They thought they had thrown me away. They thought they had won. They were wrong. I pulled out my phone, closed the message from Lila, and opened the alarm clock app. I set it for 5 a.m. The next day, and every day after, I would start again. I would apply for jobs anywhere a light was on, anywhere that would have me. I would climb my way out of this hole, 1 inch at a time, fueled by black coffee and a silent vow they would never hear until it was too late. That first year was a lifetime lived in the shadows. My existence was pared down to a brutal, efficient loop of work, survival, and study. I operated on a timetable dictated by necessity, not desire. The day was fractured into 3 distinct parts, each with its own uniform and its own particular brand of exhaustion. From 5 to 1 I was a waitress at the Greasy Spoon, a 24-hour diner off the interstate. I learned to balance 3 plates on one arm, to smile through condescension for a $2 tip, and to smell perpetually of fried onions and stale coffee. I moved through the fluorescent haze of the night shift like a ghost, my interactions brief and transactional. The customers were a parade of tired truckers, lonely travelers, and third-shift workers. I saw the fatigue in their eyes and recognized it as my own. Every dollar in tips went into a separate envelope, designated for gasoline and car insurance. From 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., I worked for a temp agency doing data entry in a windowless office park on the edge of the city. The job was mind-numbing, a rhythmic tap-tap-tap of keys under the harsh hum of overhead lighting. I transferred numbers from paper invoices into digital spreadsheets, a human cog in a machine I couldn't see. The silence of the office was broken only by the click of my keyboard and the occasional sigh from the one other person in the room. A man I never spoke to. This was the job that paid for my food. Instant noodles, day-old bread, peanut butter, survival rations. From 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., after a couple of hours of broken sleep in a secluded corner of a Walmart parking lot, I stocked shelves in the cavernous back room of a big-box retail store. It was heavy, physical labor that left my muscles aching and my mind blessedly empty. I lifted boxes, sliced them open with a utility knife, and filled the endless metal shelves with merchandise. No one talked to me here, either. I was just a pair of hands. This paycheck went directly into a savings account, the numbers growing with excruciating slowness. My Honda Civic was my bedroom, my office, and my closet. My life was contained within its 4 doors. I kept a small, black, spiral-bound notebook on the passenger seat. In it, I recorded every single cent I spent, a 99-cent coffee from a gas station, noted with the time, 10:15 p.m., after the price dropped, a 50-cent charge to use a public restroom, the $1.25 for a load of laundry. It wasn't about budgeting. It was about control. It was a ledger of my survival. Tangible proof that I was still here, still managing, still solvent. There was no room for complaint in its neat columns. Only facts. My breaks were not for rest. The hour between my data entry shift and my stocking job was spent at the public library. It opened at 8 a.m., and I was always the first one through the doors. The library was a sanctuary of silence, warmth, and most importantly, free Wi-Fi. I'd find a Carol in the back, pull out my old laptop, and plug into the world I'd been ejected from. I downloaded and read every industry paper, every market analysis report, every technical manual on data modeling I could find. I was re-educating myself, sharpening the only weapon I had left. I would read until my eyes burned, the words blurring on the screen, forcing myself to stay awake, to stay relevant. Taped across the fabric ceiling above the back seat of my car was a single sheet of paper, a hand-drawn chart I'd made with a ruler and a ballpoint pen. It was a timeline, a map out of the darkness. It had 3 main goals: secure stable housing, re-enter the data analytics field, and save $10,000. Each goal was broken down into smaller, achievable steps. The chart was my North Star. On the worst nights, when the cold was so deep, it felt like it was freezing my bones and the despair was a physical weight on my chest, I would turn on the dome light and just stare at it. It was a promise I had made to myself, held in place with strips of gray duct tape. After 11 months of this grueling routine, I saw it. I was at the library, scrolling through job listings during my precious morning hour, when the name jumped out from the screen. Halcyon Metrics. My breath caught in my throat. My old company. They were restructuring. The ad said they were launching a new division focused on risk analysis in the residential housing market. They needed a product analyst. My first instinct was to close the laptop. The thought of walking back into that building, of facing the people who had discarded me, was nauseating. But then I looked past the fear. This wasn't just a job. It was an opportunity, an opening in the wall they had built around me. I didn't just submit a resume. I knew that wouldn't be enough. I spent the next 3 days, sacrificing sleep and my stocking job, crafting a 2-page proposal. I used the knowledge I'd been accumulating for the past year. I outlined a specific, data-driven methodology for identifying fraudulent property valuation schemes used in foreclosure proceedings. I detailed how their existing data sets could be leveraged to create a predictive model that would flag high-risk transactions before they defaulted. It was concise, audacious, and it was the best work I had ever done. I attached it to my application and sent it into the void, expecting nothing. The call came at 6:12 a.m. A week later. I was in a 24-hour laundromat, folding my one interview-appropriate outfit, the warmth from the dryers, a welcome respite from the morning chill. An unknown number flashed on my screen. I almost ignored it. "Is this Nora Vale?" a professional, no-nonsense voice asked. "Yes, this is she. This is HR from Halcyon Metrics. We received your application. Your proposal has generated some interest. Can you come in for an interview this morning at 10? My heart hammered against my ribs. Yes, I can be there. I walked into the Halcyon Metrics lobby like a spy returning to enemy territory. The air still smelled the same, a sterile mix of commercial carpet cleaner and faint, expensive perfume. I was painfully aware of my worn shoes and my slightly too big blazer I'd bought at a thrift store. In the waiting area, a woman in a sharply tailored suit sat across from me. She had an air of calm authority. Seeing my hands trembling slightly in my lap, she gave me a small, encouraging smile. "Deep breaths," she said. "You're here for a reason." Then, an assistant came and called her name. As she stood, she paused by my chair. "Hang in there," she said, before walking through the frosted glass doors. I didn't know who she was, but her small act of kindness settled my nerves. It was the first unsolicited encouragement I'd received from a stranger in a year. The interview was a panel of 3 people I'd never met. They grilled me, not on my resume, but on my proposal. For 45 minutes, I was back in my element, talking about data models, risk algorithms, and market vulnerabilities. I was no longer a waitress or a stalker. I was an analyst. I was an expert. 2 days later, they called with an offer. The salary was insultingly low, barely enough to cover rent on a tiny studio apartment. It was a test. They wanted to see how desperate I was. But then came the condition, the part that made my blood run cold with possibility. The position came with a 90-day probationary period. At the end of that period, if I could demonstrate the viability of my proposed system, I would be given a 15-minute slot to present my findings directly to the executive board. I didn't hesitate. I accept. I was back inside. The salary didn't matter. The title didn't matter. All that mattered was that 90-day clause. It was a key. It was a weapon. It was my way back. They thought they were hiring a low-level analyst on the cheap. They had no idea they had just let their greatest threat walk right back through the front door. My first 90 days back at Halcyon Metrics were a study in clinical precision. I wasn't there to make friends or to reminisce about the job I'd lost. I was a surgical instrument, brought in for a specific task. On day 1, I walked into my designated cubicle, a sterile white box identical to the one I'd been evicted from, and immediately requested a meeting with my new department head. Her name was Mara Keene, and I recognized her instantly as the woman who had given me the tea in the waiting room. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, showed a flicker of recognition but no sentimentality. Business was business. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I laid out the framework for my proposal, a dynamic risk-scoring model for the company's portfolio of foreclosed properties. The current system is reactive, I stated. my voice even and devoid of emotion. It identifies bad assets after they've already defaulted. My model is predictive. It uses a weighted algorithm to analyze a dozen variables: loan origination patterns, appraisal histories, title transfer frequencies, to flag potentially fraudulent assets before they become non-performing liabilities. I was asking for a pilot program, a small but quarantined data set of their worst-performing assets to prove my concept. Mara listened, her face unreadable, and at the end of my 2-minute pitch, she simply nodded. "You have 60 days," she said. "Show me something." I was given a terminal with access to a sandboxed portion of the company's servers. The data was a mess, a digital landfill of neglected files and inconsistent formatting. I spent the first week just cleaning it, writing scripts to standardize the information until it was usable. Then, I began to build. For the next 2 months, my life shrank to the dimensions of that cubicle. I worked 16-hour days, fueled by the acrid chemical broth of instant cup noodles I'd heat in the break room microwave. My world was the cool glow of the monitor and the quiet hum of the building's HVAC system long after everyone else had gone home. The bright, open-plan office of the day would transform into a cavern of shadows at night. My desk a lonely island of light cast by a single 15-watt lamp I'd brought from my new, tiny apartment. Within 3 weeks, the model started flagging a pattern. It was a faint but persistent anomaly in a series of foreclosures concentrated in several down-market suburban developments. In each case, the property had been refinanced multiple times in rapid succession, artificially inflating its value before defaulting. The final title transfer before foreclosure was consistently processed by the same entity, a company called North Cove Title. The name meant nothing to me then. It was just a data point, a recurring signature in a sea of digital noise. I documented it, cross-referenced it, and watched as its name appeared again and again, linked exclusively to the most toxic assets in the portfolio. I presented my initial findings to Mara Keene. I didn't offer theories or accusations, only the data. I showed her the charts, the statistical correlations, the undeniable link between North Cove Title and a cluster of high-loss properties. She studied the screen for a long time, her fingers steepled under her chin. "This is more than a pattern," she said finally. "It's a methodology." The next morning, she expanded my access. I was given a small team, a junior data scientist and 2 interns, and crucially, the key to the archives, read-only access to Halcyon's historical transaction data going back 20 years. She was giving me the rope. It was up to me to see who was at the other end of it. With the expanded data set and the help of my team, my pilot project went into overdrive. We worked through the night, tracing the ghost-like tendrils of North Cove's transactions back through the years. The model became smarter, more refined. At the end of the quarter, the results were submitted for review. They were stark and irrefutable. The assets flagged by my system, had they been divested earlier, would have prevented a cascade of losses. The final calculation showed that my model, in its trial run alone, would have reduced the company's bad debt in that specific portfolio by 18%. The promotion came a week later. I was made product manager of the new risk analytics division. The title was a formality. The salary was freedom. It was enough to move out of the cramped studio and into a proper 1-bedroom apartment. It was enough to replace my threadbare thrift store clothes. It was enough to breathe, for the first time in over a year. I felt the ground firm up beneath my feet. I had a nameplate on my door. I had a future that wasn't a hand-drawn chart taped to the inside of a car. It was a Tuesday night, and I was doing what I now did instead of sleeping, running wider spectrum analyses on public property databases, looking for North Cove's footprint outside of Halcyon's direct sphere of influence. I was scrolling through a county foreclosure auction list when my eyes snagged on a street name, Willow Street. My fingers froze over the keyboard. A cold dread, heavy and familiar, washed over me. I typed the house number into the search bar, my heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against my ribs, and there it was, the listing for my uncle's house, the house I was thrown out of. I read the details with a clinical detachment that felt like a betrayal of the shaking in my hands. The property was in default. The legal documents attached showed a series of convoluted refinances, a debt spiral that had finally collapsed. They had taken out second and third mortgages, leveraging the house to its breaking point, and the name of the trustee, the entity legally overseeing the foreclosure sale on behalf of the creditors, was North Cove Title. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a coincidence. My family hadn't just been unlucky. They had been players in the same crooked game I was now tasked with dismantling. The company that had facilitated their financial ruin was the same one I was hunting in the corporate world. The two halves of my life, the personal and the professional, had just collided with explosive force. The auction was on a Friday morning in a sterile, windowless room in the county administration building. I wore my best suit, the armor of my new life. I registered to bid with hands that trembled so badly I could barely sign my name. I had already arranged the financing. I used my entire life savings, every dollar I had clawed back from the brink, and supplemented it with a home loan from Halcyon's Employee Credit Union, a benefit of my new position. I was leveraging my success at the company to buy the scene of my greatest humiliation. When the auctioneer called the address on Willow Street, the room fell away. I saw Roy's face as he slid the deadbolt. I heard Lila's callous text message echo in my ears. I felt the shattering of the glass on my graduation photo. I bid. Another person countered. I bid again. My voice a strange, calm whisper in the quiet room. We went back and forth, the numbers climbing. Finally, the other bidder shook his head. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot. "Sold," he declared, "to bidder number 73. I sat there for a moment, the blood roaring in my ears. Then I walked to the front of the room on unsteady legs and signed the paperwork. The clerk handed me a large manila envelope with the preliminary deed and a single, newly cut key. It was cold and sharp in my palm. That afternoon, I drove to Willow Street. The house looked smaller, shabbier than I remembered. I walked up the same concrete path where my picture frame had shattered. I put the key in the lock. It slid in smoothly, a perfect fit. I turned it, and the deadbolt, the very same one Roy had used to lock me out, retracted with a quiet, satisfying click. The door swung open, a cynical story, I thought, had just completed its first half. The air inside was a time capsule. It smelled of dust, of faded floral air freshener, and a faint, underlying sourness of neglect. The silence was absolute, a thick, heavy blanket that muffled the sounds of the outside world. This wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a crime scene after the fact. The furniture was gone, leaving pale rectangles on the faded carpets and ghostly outlines on the walls where pictures used to hang. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing unnaturally. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the house settling, felt like a whisper from the past. I wasn't a homeowner, I was an archaeologist, and my excavation had just begun. My methodical sweep of the house started in the living room. It was where Roy had held court, where he'd made his pronouncements from his worn leather armchair. The chair was gone, but an indentation remained in the carpet, a stubborn ghost. The focal point of the room was the brick fireplace, its mantelpiece dark with soot. I ran a hand over the cool brick, remembering cold nights when the heating was kept deliberately low. I wasn't looking for sentiment. I was looking for mistakes. My eyes caught on the metal grate of a small ventilation duct near the floor, almost hidden by the hearth. One of the 4 flathead screws holding it in place was slightly askew, its slot not aligned with the others. It was a tiny imperfection, the kind of detail an analyst's eye is trained to catch. I retrieved a multi-tool from my bag. The screw turned with surprising ease, its threads barely biting into the aging drywall. The grate came away in my hand. Inside the dark, dusty cavity, almost invisible against the black metal, was a thick brown manila envelope. It was brittle with age. My heart rate quickened, but my hands remained steady. I took the envelope to the center of the room, using the floor as a table, and carefully opened the unsealed flap. The contents were a Rosetta Stone of my family's deceit. The first document was a carbon copy of a personal loan agreement, dated 7 years prior. The lender was a private entity I'd never heard of, but the borrower was clearly listed: Roy Vale. Stapled to it was a handwritten ledger on yellow legal paper. It was a list of payments, dozens of them, all marked as cash. Beside each entry was a date and Roy's spiky, impatient signature, but the most damning items were at the bottom. A stack of receipts. Each was a small, pre-printed slip acknowledging a cash payment, and each one bore a faint, almost illegible rubber stamp in the corner. I angled it toward the light coming from the window. The letters were purple, slightly blurred, but unmistakable. North Cove title. I pulled out my phone and cross-referenced the dates on the receipts. With the payment dates listed on the official bank foreclosure documents I'd been studying for weeks, they didn't match. Roy had been making off-the-books payments, and North Cove had been the one collecting and falsifying the records. This wasn't just a loan, it was a conspiracy, and I was holding the minutes of their first meeting. My first act as the new owner was to fortify my position. That afternoon, I installed a high-definition smart doorbell with a wide-angle lens and motion-activated recording. I wasn't just monitoring the front door, I was creating a digital log, a time-stamped record of every person who approached, every visitor, every delivery, every uninvited guest would be documented. The house had been a silent witness for years. I was finally giving it a voice and a memory that couldn't be erased. In the kitchen, a persistent flicker from the overhead fluorescent light sent a jolt of unpleasant memory through me. It was the same erratic strobe that had illuminated our tense dinners, a constant, irritating reminder of Roy's refusal to spend money on unnecessary repairs. He'd once let the power get cut off for 2 days over a disputed late fee. The flicker was the rhythm of his neglect. I stood on a chair, unscrewed the housing, and carefully disconnected the old, faulty ballast and starter. I replaced the entire fixture with a new, bright LED unit that flooded the room with clean, unwavering light. I didn't throw the old components away. I placed them in a labeled evidence bag and stored them with the envelope. It was proof of the house's condition, another small testament to the history of the previous regime. The next morning, I was outside pulling weeds from the overgrown flower bed when my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Callow, shuffled over. She was a tiny woman with eyes that had seen everything on this street for 50 years. "Heard you were the one who bought the place," she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Good. Never did like that Roy Vale. Always a shortcut. That one." She leaned closer over the rickety fence. "You know, they used to rent out the basement. Had a fellow living down there for 2 years. Never declared it. Of course, all cash. Used to see him sneaking out the side door before dawn." She tapped the side of her nose. "Just thought you should know the kind of people you're dealing with." Another secret the walls had kept. Another source of illicit cash flow that explained the ledger in the envelope. That night, I took the original architectural blueprints I'd obtained from the county records office and spread them across the living room floor. With a red pen, I began to annotate, to create my own map of the house's history. I marked the location of the loose vent. I drew a dotted line from the basement side door, marking the path of the illegal tenant. Mrs. Callow's words had triggered another memory. A small, crudely patched square of drywall on the ceiling of the downstairs hallway, right above the door to the basement stairs. At the time, Roy had claimed it was a water leak. Now, I saw it differently. It was the perfect spot to have drilled a hole, to have snaked a wire through for a hidden camera or microphone, monitoring the undeclared tenant. I circled the patch in red. The house was no longer just a structure. It was a diagram of a crime. In the back bedroom, the one that had been Lila's, I pulled a built-in dresser away from the wall to check for mold. On the wallpaper behind it, near the floor, were a series of thin, parallel scratches. I remembered their old cat, a nervous calico named Patches that Roy had despised. These were her marks. a forgotten sign of a small life that had also been trapped in this house. A wave of unexpected sadness washed over me. I took a small container of spackle and carefully filled the gouges in the wall, smoothing the surface with my finger. But I didn't paint over it. I left the small, white, repaired scars. A reminder that not everything that had been broken in this house was part of the crime. Some of it was just collateral damage. Before going to bed, I took a clean sheet of paper and a black marker, in clear block letters. I wrote a single sentence. "This house will testify for me." I placed the note in the very center of the kitchen counter, the only object in the vast, empty room. It was a declaration of intent, a promise to the structure around me. My last task was the most important. I called a 24-hour locksmith. He arrived within the hour, a quiet, efficient man who didn't ask questions. He worked under the glare of the new porch light, drilling out the old cylinders, removing the hardware that my family had touched, had used to lock me out. He installed heavy-duty deadbolts on all the exterior doors. He handed me a set of new keys, their edges sharp and clean. They felt heavy, solid. I paid him in cash and watched him drive away. I stood in the now silent entryway and performed the final ritual. I inserted a new key into the new lock on the front door. I turned it. The bolt slid home with a heavy, satisfying thunk, a sound of absolute finality, a sound of security. I was locked in. They were locked out. The house was mine. The evidence was gathered. The stage was set. All I had to do now was wait for the first knock. The knock came on a Friday, not a timid rap, but 3 sharp, proprietary thuds that echoed through the empty house. I wasn't surprised. I had been waiting. On my phone, the doorbell camera's live feed showed me their faces, distorted slightly by the wide-angle lens. Roy, his jaw set in a mask of righteous indignation, his shoulders squared as if preparing for a physical confrontation, and beside him, slightly behind, was Lila. She looked pale and uncertain, clutching a large, yellow document folder to her chest like a shield. Before answering, I rewound the motion-activated recording by 30 seconds. The audio was crystal clear. I watched Roy turn his head slightly, his voice a low, urgent hiss, meant only for his daughter. "Just give it to her. She'll get scared. This is our house. Remember that." Lila gave a jerky, almost imperceptible nod, her eyes fixed on the door, not on her father. I saved the clip. Then, I walked to the door. I opened it slowly. The silence that stretched between us was thick with 5 years of unspoken history. They stood on my porch, framed by the doorway, looking like actors who had forgotten their lines. Roy recovered first. He puffed out his chest, a caricature of patriarchal authority. "You're just holding this house for us," he said, his voice attempting a boom that fell flat in the open air. "We're here to take it back." Lila, prompted by a sharp nudge from her father, stepped forward and held out the folder. Her hand was trembling. "This is a quitclaim deed," she said, her voice thin, reedy. "Grandma signed it over to the family 20 years ago. The house was never yours to buy." I looked from the folder to their faces. I offered them a smile that felt alien on my own lips, a polite, distant gesture that didn't reach my eyes. "It's chilly out here," I said, my voice unnervingly calm. "Please, come in." I stepped back, holding the door wide open. Their confusion was palpable. This was not the reaction they had rehearsed. They exchanged a quick, uncertain glance before stepping over the threshold into the cavernous, empty living room. The bare walls seemed to amplify the sound of their footsteps on the hardwood floors. The house itself felt like a vast, silent courtroom, and they were the first to take the stand. "Would you like some tea?" I asked, walking toward the equally bare kitchen. The question was so absurd, so domestically polite in the face of their aggression, that it threw them completely off balance. "We're not here for tea," Roy blustered, recovering his footing. "I insist," I said, filling a kettle with water. The sound of the running tap was loud in the silence. "We have important documents to discuss. We should be comfortable." I gestured to the floor. Please, have a seat. There was nowhere else to sit. Roy remained standing, stiff with indignation, but Lila, looking lost, sank down to the floor, tucking her feet under her and placing the folder in her lap. I placed the kettle on the stove, and the high-pitched click of the gas igniter sounded like a gavel. I walked back into the living room and knelt on the floor opposite them. May I? I asked, holding my hand out for the folder. Lila flinched but handed it over. The paper was old, brittle at the edges. I slid the document out. It was what she said it was, a quitclaim deed, dated 2 decades ago, bearing what was supposed to be my grandmother's signature, relinquishing all her rights to the property to a trust managed by Roy Vale, my grandmother, who at that time was already in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's and could barely sign her own name consistently on a get-well card. I scanned the page, my eyes moving over the legal jargon, but I was looking for only one thing, and then I found it. At the bottom of the page, in the section reserved for the notary public, the embossed seal was faint, but the signature was clear. A looping, ostentatious script I recognized from 100 birthday cards. Daphne Vale, my aunt. The stamp from her notary commission listed her office address, an address I had cross-referenced in my research just last week. It was a satellite office for North Cove Title. The connection was no longer a theory. It was here, in my hands, on a forged document, signed by my own family. I carefully slid the paper back into its folder and placed it on the floor between us. The kettle began to whistle from the kitchen, a rising, piercing scream that filled the tense silence. "This is a very interesting document," I said, my voice level. Roy took that as his cue. "It's ironclad. You're a squatter. Nora, we're giving you 24 hours to vacate the premises before we call the police and have you removed." "You think I'm squatting?" I asked, a genuine hint of curiosity in my voice. "We know you are," he spat. "This is a family estate. You have no claim." I looked at him, then at Lila, who was staring intently at a scuff mark on the floor. I smiled again, wider this time. "Then you should call them. Please, I invite you to—" I pulled my phone from my pocket. "Here, you can use my phone. I'll even look up the non-emergency number for you." Roy stared at me. His bluff called. He was sputtering, searching for a new line of attack. The kettle in the kitchen shrieked. "One moment," I said. Standing up, I walked calmly to the stove, turned off the flame, and the whistle died with a sigh. While my back was to them, I opened my email. I attached a file from my cloud storage, a scanned PDF of the notarized, recorded, and legally binding grant deed from the county foreclosure auction, clearly stating my name as the sole and legal owner of the property. I typed their email addresses, which I knew by heart, into the recipient line. I hit send. A moment later, Roy's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his expression shifting from anger to confusion as he read the screen. Lila looked up at him, her face a question. "I've just sent you a copy of my paperwork," I said, returning to my spot on the floor. "The sale was public, legal, and recorded with the county last month. This house is mine. Roy, I own it, free and clear." He stared at his phone, then at me, his mind clearly struggling to process this new reality. The forged document in the folder was his entire strategy, and it had just evaporated, but his arrogance was a deep well. He scoffed, a raw, ugly sound in the quiet room. "A foreclosure sale? That's meaningless," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "The original deed supersedes that. The court will sort this out. This is a Vale estate. It belongs to the bloodline." The word bloodline hung in the air, the same blood that ran in my veins, that he had decided was worthless the moment I lost my paycheck. "You're right," I said, my voice now as cold and hard as steel. "The court will sort it out." I stood up. The meeting now concluded. "I look forward to it. My lawyer will be in touch with yours." I paused, then added, "Absolutely. Let's meet at the Land and Title Court. How is Tuesday for you?" The finality in my tone left no room for argument. They were being dismissed. From my house. Roy got to his feet, his face flushed with a dark, mottled anger. He snatched the folder from the floor. Lila scrambled up after him, looking smaller and more frightened than ever. They walked to the door without another word. I didn't follow them. I simply stood in the center of the living room and watched them go. After the door closed, I waited, on my phone. I watched the doorbell cameras feed. I watched them storm down the walkway. I watched Roy's car screech away from the curb. The house was silent again. The invasion was over. I picked up my phone. I navigated to the saved video clip, the one with Roy's whispered instructions to Lila. I composed a new email, this one addressed to Mara Keene and the head of Halcyon's corporate legal department. I attached the short video file. My caption was 5 simple words. A syndicate is starting to surface. The email I sent landed like a depth charge. The response from Mara Keene came less than an hour later, at 7:05 p.m. It was a summons, not a question. My office? Now? Whoa. The upper floors of the Halcyon building were a different world at night, a silent landscape of glass and steel under pools of recessed lighting. Mara was standing at her floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city's glittering grid. She didn't turn around when I entered. "The video you sent," she said, her voice calm, measured. "The man is Roy Vale. The woman is Lila Vale. Your family." It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. "Yes," I replied. "And the document they're referencing is connected to North Cove Title, through the notary." "Yes." She finally turned to face me. "Our internal risk monitors flagged North Cove this morning, a statistical improbability in their transaction closures over the last quarter. Your pilot model predicted it, but the new data shows the velocity is increasing. It's a wildfire." She pointed to the chair in front of her desk. "Forget the pilot program. Your new job is North Cove. I want you to pull on this thread until it unravels. Use whatever resources you need. I want to know who they are, who they work for, and how deep their rot goes into our assets." She was giving me corporate sanction to investigate my own family. The irony was glacial. For the next 72 hours, I didn't leave the office. My team and I worked in a locked conference room, the glass walls papered over. We were a ghost unit, operating outside the normal company structure. We dove into the archives, the 20 years of historical data Mara had unlocked. My target was specific. Every document, every transfer, every deed that bore North Cove's name. And there, I found her signature. Over and over again. Daphne Vale. In the last 2 years alone, my aunt's notary stamp appeared on 53 separate Halcyon-related property transfers processed by North Cove. 53. Her signature. Once a familiar, friendly loop on birthday cards, now looked like a series of identical pieces of barbed wire. Each one was a link in a chain, tying my family directly to the heart of the fraudulent activity I was exposing. These weren't random acts. This was a pattern of behavior. This was a career. But North Cove was a shell, a legal fiction designed to absorb liability. The real question was who owned it. It took one of my interns, a caffeine-fueled prodigy named Ben, 2 full days of tracing corporate registration records through 3 different states to find the answer. North Cove Title was a wholly owned subsidiary of a small, private equity fund with a blandly reassuring name. The Harkwell Fund. It was a ghost, with almost no public profile, but it had one legal officer whose name was on the public record. I ran the name through our internal competitive intelligence database. The result hit my screen like a flash of lightning. The sole proprietor of the Harkwell Fund was Marcus Thorne, the chief financial officer of Helion Data, our biggest rival. A memory, cold and sharp, surfaced instantly. A LinkedIn message from a Helion recruiter about a year ago, a series of emails, a generous, almost desperate, offer for a senior analyst position. They had tried to poach me. At the time, I'd been flattered but had declined, loyal to the work I was doing at Halcyon. Now, that offer felt sinister. Had they been trying to hire me for my skills, or was it something else? Were they trying to buy my silence before I even knew I had something to say? Were they trying to remove a potential threat from the board? The final piece of the puzzle was the money. I tasked my team with creating a visual map of the financial transactions between the three entities. On the massive smartboard in the conference room, we projected the data. Ben coded a simple visualization. Helion data was a large, stable blue sun on one side of the screen. North Cove title was a chaotic red cluster of individual transactions on the other. And in the middle was the Harkwell Fund, a small, dark green node. Then we ran the trace. Lines of light began to streak across the screen, showing the flow of capital. A thick, steady river of funds moved from Helion to Harkwell. Then, from Harkwell, smaller, targeted payments went out to North Cove to finance their operations. And finally, the proceeds from the fraudulent foreclosures, including the inflated loans on properties like the one on Willow Street, flowed from North Cove back to Harkwell, where the money was absorbed, legitimized, and eventually passed back to Helion as investment returns. It looked like a string of Christmas lights, blinking in a predatory rhythm. It was a closed loop, a perfect, self-sustaining machine for generating illicit cash. "They're washing the assets," I whispered, staring at the screen. That's when I knew what to look for. I directed the system to search for properties within the North Cove portfolio that shared a specific characteristic: a historical appraisal that had been manually overridden and replaced within a short time frame. It was a digital form of forgery. The system chugged for 20 minutes, then produced a list of 212 properties. My eyes scanned the column of addresses, and there it was, 142 Willow Street. My house was on the list. Its legitimate appraisal history had been washed, replaced by the inflated values from Roy's fraudulent refinances. The entire plan laid itself bare in my mind, cold and complete. It was never just about my family's greed. They were pawns, useful cogs in a much larger machine. Helion, through Harkwell and North Cove, would identify a vulnerable property. They would facilitate a series of fraudulent loans, stripping all the equity and more. Knowing the homeowner would eventually default, North Cove would then handle the foreclosure. That's where I came in. By buying the house at auction, I had disrupted their plan to quietly absorb the property into their own portfolio, so they activated their contingency. The 20-year-old, forged quitclaim deed, notarized by their inside agent, Daphne. Their goal was to use this crude legal instrument to scare me away, reclaim the property, and then execute a clean sale from the Vale Family Trust to a holding company owned by the Harkwell Fund. It would complete the wash cycle, transforming a fraudulently foreclosed property into a clean, marketable asset on their books. My personal history, my family, had been weaponized as part of a corporate scheme. I turned from the board to my workstation. I knew I had enough. I didn't need a confession. The data was the confession. I isolated 12 specific data fields for each of the 212 properties on the list. Fields like Notary Commission ID, Appraisal Override Timestamp, and Loan Origination Source IP. When cross-referenced, these 12 fields created a unique, undeniable digital fingerprint of fraud for each transaction. It was more than enough to force a federal audit. It was enough to burn North Cove title to the ground. I spent the next 4 hours writing my report. I was no longer an analyst. I was a prosecutor drafting an indictment. I detailed the methodology, the financial pathways, the key players. I embedded screenshots of the transaction map and a list of Daphne Vale's 53 notarizations. I attached the list of the 212 properties with the 12 fields of incriminating data highlighted. It was a cold, factual, and utterly damning document. I addressed the email to Halcyon's entire executive control board, including Mara Keene. Then, in the CC field, I typed another address, one I had looked up earlier, the public email for the chief prosecutor of the Real Estate Fraud Division for the County District Attorney's Office. I hesitated for only a second, my finger hovering over the mouse. This would escalate everything beyond the confines of a corporate rivalry. It would make it a criminal matter. It would make it real. I clicked send. The email left my outbox with a quiet whoosh. I leaned back in my chair. the silence of the conference room pressing in on me. I looked at the glowing map on the screen, the blinking lights connecting my family's house to our company's greatest rival. And in that silent moment, I finally understood. My revenge was no longer about a single house on Willow Street. It wasn't about a cold night in a car or a deadbolt sliding shut. That was just the prologue. This was about dismantling a system, about exposing a rot that ran through the very foundations of the world I worked in. My family hadn't just thrown me out. They had inadvertently given me a reason to burn down their entire world. The week began with a declaration of war on two fronts. The email to the board had lit a firestorm within Halcyon, and my uncle's predictable legal challenge had set the clock ticking externally. My strategy was a pincer movement, designed to close from both sides on a single day. Tuesday. Tuesday morning was scheduled for a full executive risk committee meeting at Halcyon. Tuesday afternoon was the preliminary hearing for the ownership claim of 142 Willow Street, the boardroom and the courtroom. One would dismantle their financial engine, the other would dismantle their family's lie. There would be no escape. The preparation was a military operation. My life became a series of calculated steps, each one a weapon being sharpened. For the boardroom, I distilled my sprawling report into a presentation of 22 slides. It was a masterpiece of cold, corporate lethality. I began with the data, the 18% reduction in bad debt my model had achieved. Then I pivoted. Slide 5 was a stark black screen with a single name in white letters, North Cove Title. The next slide was the transaction map, the blinking Christmas lights of Helion's money laundering scheme. I dedicated an entire slide to Aunt Daphne's signature, showing it repeated 12 times on 12 different fraudulent documents, the dates and locations an impossible tangle. The final slide was a black square with a single, universal play icon in the center. It was the embedded video file from my doorbell. My case against Helion would end with my uncle's own voice. But a corporate presentation wasn't enough. I needed to bait the hook for the legal case. On Saturday, I placed a small, professionally printed open house sign on the front lawn of Willow Street. I listed the time. Sunday, 2 to 4 p.m. Then I did some research, cross-referencing North Cove's recent sales with local real estate agents. I found him easily. A smarmy-looking agent named Rick, who had been the listing agent on 4 of the washed properties I'd identified. I sent a targeted social media ad for my open house directly to real estate professionals in a 5-mile radius. Knowing he would see it, it was a trap laid in plain sight. On Sunday, I sat at a cheap folding table in the empty living room. A single vase of grocery store carnations was my only prop. I had a guest book and a pen. At 2:45, Rick walked in. He had the overconfident swagger of a man who believed he was cleverer than everyone else. He barely looked at the house. He was here for reconnaissance. "Just seeing what the competition is up to," he said with a greasy smile. "Of course," I replied, gesturing to the book. "Please, sign in." He scribbled his name and contact information without a thought. The pen I'd handed him was special, filled with ink that was only visible under ultraviolet light. After he left, I took the guest book into the windowless bathroom, closed the door, and clicked on a small UV flashlight. Under the eerie purple glow, his signature was perfectly clear. I took a high-resolution photograph. I now had proof of a known North Cove associate showing professional interest in the property, a tangible link to their ongoing scheme to reacquire it. Monday was a day of legal maneuvers, working with Halcyon's corporate counsel, who was now my personal counsel in this matter. We filed the official request to subpoena Daphne Vale. Our evidence was a simple timeline. It showed her notarizing a Halcyon document at a North Cove office downtown at 2:15 p.m. on a specific date, and then, on the same day, notarizing a deed for a property 120 miles away, with a timestamp of 3:45 p.m. It was a physical impossibility. We weren't just questioning her signature, we were accusing her of perjury and fraud. She would be compelled to appear in court and explain. Next, my lawyer filed a motion to introduce audio-visual evidence. We submitted the doorbell clip of Roy whispering, "Just give it to her. She'll get scared." The legal brief argued it was not merely a family dispute, but demonstrated premeditated intent to commit fraud through intimidation. The judge would rule on its admissibility on Tuesday. That afternoon, I called Mrs. Callow. Her voice was thin but steady over the phone. I asked her if she would be willing to provide a sworn affidavit about the illegal basement tenant. She didn't hesitate. "For you, dear? After what they did? I'll come down to the courthouse myself." Her testimony would corroborate the off-the-books cash payments and establish a clear pattern of financial deception that predated the foreclosure. One crucial piece was missing. I needed a clean, undeniable sample of my grandmother's signature from before her illness took hold. I messaged Ben, the intern who had helped me trace the Harkwell Fund. His cousin worked in the county records archive. It was a long shot, but I asked him if there was any way to find the original 25-year-old mortgage origination document for the Willow Street house, the one my grandparents would have signed when they first bought it. 2 hours later, an encrypted file appeared in my inbox. The scan was grainy, but the signature was there. My grandmother's elegant, looping script, clear and strong. That night, alone in my apartment, I opened 2 files on my laptop. On the left was the scan of the original, authentic signature. On the right was a high-resolution scan of the forged signature on the quitclaim deed, signed by Daphne Vale, Notary Public. The difference was stark. The original flowed. The forgery was drawn, hesitant despite its attempt at confidence. It was the final, irrefutable nail. I prepared a side-by-side comparison for the court, a single exhibit that would obliterate their entire case in an instant. As I shut down my computer, the adrenaline of the past few days began to recede, leaving a cold, quiet calm in its wake. The plans were laid, the traps were set, the evidence was marshaled, every variable was accounted for. I stood in the dark, looking out my own window at the city lights. I felt the familiar, bitter anger begin to rise. The memory of the cold concrete, the sound of the deadbolt. I took a slow, deep breath and pushed it down. Emotion was a liability. It clouded judgment and created openings for the enemy. I had one final instruction, and it was for myself. Do not get angry. Do not attack. Just present the facts. The truth would be my only weapon, and the facts would be my executioners. The boardroom at Halcyon Metrics was a theater of power. It was a long, refrigerated chamber of glass and polished mahogany, 30 floors above the city. The executive committee, 12 men and women in bespoke suits, sat around the table, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of their tablets. They were the titans of my small world, the people who had, 5 years ago, signed off on the memo that eliminated my position. Today, they were my captive audience. Mara Keene sat to the right of the CEO, her expression neutral, giving nothing away. I stood at the head of the table, the remote for the projector cool and solid in my hand. I clicked it once. The screen behind me, a vast black mirror, flickered to life. The first slide was simple, stark, and brutal. 6 words in a clean, white, sans serif font. A pattern of appraisal fraud via North Cove title. A low murmur rippled through the room. I let the silence settle for a beat, then clicked again. I walked them through the data, my voice a calm, even monotone. I showed them the risk model's predictions, the statistical anomalies, the initial red flags. It was dry, clinical, the language of corporate compliance. And then I laid the trap. The operational arm for these high-risk transactions, I said, my voice dropping slightly, is a consistent entity, North Cove title. However, North Cove is merely a shell, a legal firewall. Its parent entity is a private equity vehicle. I clicked the remote. The screen changed. 3 logos appeared, connected by sharp, directional arrows. On the left, the familiar, aggressive logo of Helion Data. In the middle, the discreet, anonymous emblem of the Harkwell Fund. On the right, the cheap, generic logo of North Cove title. The effect was instantaneous. It was as if someone had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. The quiet tapping of a pen stopped. A man in the middle of taking a sip of water froze, his glass halfway to his lips. The air became thick, heavy, and utterly silent. In that moment, Halion Data went from being a competitor to a predator, and we were the prey. Helion is funding this operation through a proxy fund, I continued, letting the image burn into their retinas. They use North Cove to identify and process vulnerable properties within our own portfolio, strip them of their equity through fraudulent refinancing, and then absorb the laundered asset. I clicked again. The screen now showed the blinking spiderweb-like map of financial transactions. This is the flow of capital, I said, a closed loop, but the fraud is not just financial, it is systemic. I used the remote to zoom in on the map, the lines of light rushing toward the screen until they converged on a single, blinking red dot on the far right of the chart. And it is personal. The address appeared below the dot, 142 Willow Street. This property, I said, meeting the eyes of the CEO, is my primary residence, acquired last month via a foreclosure auction, a foreclosure that was managed by North Cove Title. The silence in the room was now layered with shock. Mara Keene broke it. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. Evidence integrity, Ms. Vale? It was the question I was waiting for, the official challenge from the board. Chain of custody on all documents, I answered without hesitation. Immutable timestamps on all digital transactions, and sworn witness testimony. The CEO, a man named Arthur Sterling, who I had only ever seen in corporate headshots, turned his head slowly to look at the company's chief legal counsel. He didn't need to consult the board. His authority was absolute. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low rumble, "prepare a formal notification for the district attorney's office. Full cooperation." The lawyer, a severe woman with graying hair, simply nodded and made a note on her tablet. The decision had been made. Halcyon was going to war. The rest of the presentation was a formality. I detailed the number of affected assets, the potential financial exposure, the clear pattern of corporate espionage. When I was finished, I walked from the podium to the polished mahogany table. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single, thin file folder. I placed it gently on the table, directly in front of Sterling. "I am a direct victim of this chain," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the still room. "My family was targeted and manipulated by this syndicate. They are now attempting to fraudulently reclaim my home on behalf of these interests, using forged documents notarized by a North Cove employee." My statement hung in the air. A board member on the far side of the table, a man named Richards, who I knew from my research had a minority stake in a fund that invested in Harkwell, cleared his throat. He looked pale. "If you'll excuse me," he murmured, pushing his chair back. "A prior engagement." He stood and walked quickly, silently, from the room without looking at anyone. His empty chair was a confession. Sterling looked at the folder, then at me. His eyes were like chips of ice. "The board will vote," he announced, "all in favor of suspending any and all transactions with entities, subsidiaries, or known associates connected to the Harkwell Fund, and of authorizing Miss Vale to act as our primary witness and liaison with the DA's office in this matter, with the full legal and financial backing of this company." 12 hands went up around the table. It was unanimous. I had been given my sword and my shield. I walked back to the podium and clicked the remote one last time. The screen went black. For a long moment, the only thing visible was my own reflection, a pale, dark-suited figure against the void. I looked different. The fear that had been my constant companion for 5 years, a low-grade hum of anxiety beneath the surface of everything I did, was gone. The woman staring back at me was a stranger, her expression composed, her eyes clear and cold. She was no longer a victim. She was an instrument. My phone, which I'd placed on the podium, vibrated, the buzz unnaturally loud in the quiet room. I glanced at the screen. It was a text message from a number I hadn't seen in 5 years, but that I still had saved under a contact name I'd never bothered to change. Lila. The message was short, Panicked. Aunt Daphne isn't coming to court. She's not answering her phone. Dad says the lawyer told her not to come. I read the words. They thought they had found a loophole, a way to stall, to evade. A small smile touched my lips, a cold, sharp curve that my reflection mirrored back at me. I slipped the phone into my pocket. Oh, she'll be there. I thought, she just doesn't know it yet. The courtroom was cold, not with the ambient chill of overactive air conditioning, but with the sterile, indifferent cold of institutional justice. The wood was dark, polished to a dull gleam under the flat, humming fluorescent lights. A carved state seal hung over the judge's bench like a disinterested eye. I sat at the respondent's table with Halcyon's lawyer, a woman named Eleanor Vance, whose quiet confidence was more intimidating than any overt aggression. Across the aisle, Roy sat ramrod straight, his cheap suit pulled tight across his shoulders. His lawyer was a local man with a sheen of perspiration on his upper lip. Lila was beside them, a ghost in a gray cardigan, staring at her own hands, twisting a loose thread on her cuff. And at the very back of the courtroom, on a bench by the door, sat Daphne. Lila's text had been a lie, a clumsy attempt at psychological warfare. The subpoena had left no room for refusal. She looked small and terrified, a mouse cornered in a cage of her own making. Roy's lawyer opened, his voice attempting a folksy, earnest tone that didn't fit the room. He spoke of heritage, of legacy, of a grandmother's wish to keep a home in the family. He painted me as an opportunistic outsider, a distant relative swooping in to pick at the bones of a family tragedy. Then Roy, against his lawyer's visible advice, chose to speak for himself. He stood, addressing the judge as if he were chastising a disobedient employee. "Your Honor," he began, his voice ringing with self-righteousness. "This is simple. That house is a repository of Vale family history. It is our birthright. My niece here," he gestured at me with a flick of his wrist, "took advantage of a temporary financial difficulty. The Vale family legacy was stolen, and we are here to reclaim it." He sat down, looking immensely pleased with himself. The judge, a woman with weary, intelligent eyes, made a small note and then looked at us. "Ms. Vance?" Eleanor rose. She didn't address Roy's speech. She addressed the facts. "Your Honor, we will be submitting 4 primary exhibits to prove my client's sole and legal ownership and to demonstrate the plaintiff's claim is fraudulent." The procedural dance began. The court clerk, a man with the slow, deliberate movements of a chess player, took our first exhibit. "Exhibit A," Eleanor stated, "is the legally recorded grant deed from the Clark County foreclosure auction, dated last month, granting full and unencumbered title of the property at 142 Willow Street to my client, Nora Vale." The clerk handed a copy to the judge and another to Roy's lawyer, whose face tightened as he read it. "Exhibit B," Eleanor continued, "is a side-by-side comparison of signatures. On the left is the authenticated signature of the late Mrs. Eleanor Vale from the original 1998 mortgage documents, retrieved from the county archives. On the right is the signature as it appears on the plaintiff's purported quitclaim deed. Even from my seat, the difference was glaring. One was fluid, the other a clumsy, hesitant forgery. Exhibit C is a photograph taken at a staged open house at the property in question last Sunday. She placed the UV photograph in the clerk's hands. It is a time-stamped image of the guest book, under ultraviolet light, showing the signature of one Rick Hauser, a real estate agent known to be a primary associate of North Cove Title, the very entity that processed the fraudulent foreclosure. Roy's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection! Relevance?" "It demonstrates a continued and current effort by the parties behind this fraudulent claim to reacquire the property through their associates, Your Honor," Eleanor said calmly. The judge waved a dismissive hand at the lawyer. "Overruled. Continue, Ms. Vance." The trap was closing. Roy's face was beginning to flush a deep, dangerous red. He kept glancing back at Daphne, a look of pure fury in his eyes. The judge peered down from her bench, her gaze settling on the woman at the back of the room. The court calls Daphne Vale to the witness stand. Daphne flinched as if struck. She moved to the stand like a sleepwalker, her hand trembling as she was sworn in. The judge leaned forward, her voice soft but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. She held up a copy of our evidence packet. "Mrs. Vale, you are a notary public, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Daphne whispered. "I have here a document showing your notarization of a transfer for a Halcyon Metrics property in downtown at 2:15 p.m. on April 12th of last year. Is this your signature and seal?" Daphne looked at it. "Yes. And I have another document here, a deed for a property in Stone Ridge, which is 120 miles from here, also dated April 12th of last year, with a notarization timestamp of 3:45 p.m. Is this also your signature and seal?" Daphne stared at the paper, her face ashen. The impossible timeline hung in the air, a mathematical certainty of her guilt. She looked at Roy, her eyes pleading. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head, but it was too late. "Mrs. Vale," the judge prompted, her voice hardening. "It is a logistical impossibility to have been in both places. One of these documents is fraudulent. Which is it?" Daphne began to crumble. A tear traced a path down her cheek. I was told to do it." "Told by whom, Mrs. Vale?" Her voice was barely audible, a ragged gasp. "I received my instructions from North Cove." A collective hiss of indrawn breath swept through the small courtroom gallery. It was a confession, a direct link. Eleanor stood. "Your Honor, in light of this testimony, we would like to play our final exhibit." The judge nodded. A technician wheeled a small monitor to face the bench. I felt every eye in the room on me as Eleanor clicked a laptop. The screen flickered on, showing the familiar, distorted fisheye view from my front porch. Roy and Lila appeared, their faces clear, and then the audio played. Roy's voice a venomous whisper, filling the silent courtroom. "Just give it to her. She'll get scared." Lila let out a small, choked sob and buried her face in her hands. Roy looked as if he had been physically struck. Before his lawyer could even form an objection, another man stood up in the gallery. "Your Honor, if I may approach?" The judge nodded. He was a prosecutor from the DA's office. In light of the testimony and the evidence presented, the district attorney's office would like to submit for the court's record this preliminary report from Halcyon Metrics, detailing a widespread systemic pattern of fraud perpetrated by North Cove Title, Helion Data, and their known associates. He handed a thick binder to the clerk. The case of one house on Willow Street had just officially blown open into a major criminal investigation. The judge needed no more. She didn't retire to her chambers. Her decision was instant. She lifted her gavel. "Based on the evidence presented," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "this court finds the quitclaim deed submitted by the plaintiff to be fraudulent and therefore null and void." Bang! The gavel struck the wood. "The court affirms that the legal and sole owner of the property at 142 Willow Street is the respondent, Ms. Nora Vale." Bang! "And finally, this court is referring the matter of the forged deed, the perjured testimony, and the evidence of a broader conspiracy to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal prosecution." Bang! It was over, but Roy wasn't finished. He surged to his feet, his face purple with rage. Knocking his chair over, he pointed a trembling finger at me. "This is a travesty. That house is filled with our family's memories." The judge looked down at him, her expression one of utter contempt. "Memories, Mr. Vale," she said, her voice dropping to an icy calm, "are not admissible as evidence." She nodded to the bailiff. "This hearing is concluded." A large uniformed officer stepped toward Roy. "Sir, you need to come with me." The fight drained out of him, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. The officer opened a side door, and the sound of Roy and Lila's footsteps, one shuffling in defeat, the other hurried and sobbing, echoed down the long, empty hallway, the sound of a play that had reached its grim, inevitable end. I stood on shaky legs, the adrenaline finally leaving my system. The clerk approached me, holding the documents I had submitted. He removed the single house key that had been attached as part of the evidence. He held it out to me. "This is yours, ma'am." I took it. It felt cold from the air-conditioned room, but its weight in my palm was substantial, solid, and entirely my own. The drive back to Willow Street was different. The streets of Greybridge, once a landscape of my failure and exile, now felt like foreign territory I had successfully conquered. The car, my former shelter and prison, was now just a vehicle. When I turned onto the final street, I saw them. They were standing on the sidewalk, just in front of the walkway, like two statues marking a forgotten battlefield. They had positioned themselves deliberately in the blind spot of the doorbell camera, a final, pathetic attempt to control a narrative that had long since escaped them. I pulled into the driveway and killed the engine. The silence that descended was profound. I didn't get out immediately. I just watched them through the windshield. Roy's shoulders were slumped, the righteous fury from the courtroom replaced by a brittle, hollowed-out look. Lila was staring at the house, her expression unreadable, a mixture of longing and fear. They were waiting for a final scene, a confrontation, a plea for forgiveness. Perhaps. They were waiting for a resolution that would center them. They would not get it. From my briefcase on the passenger seat, I retrieved a small, professionally laminated sign. Then, I got out of the car. The sound of my own door closing seemed unnaturally loud. I didn't look at them. My focus was on the house, my house. I walked up the concrete path, my heels clicking a steady, unhurried rhythm. I knelt down by the porch steps, in the small patch of manicured grass I had weeded just last week, and pushed the sign's small metal stake firmly into the earth. It stood upright, facing the street, a clean white rectangle with sharp black letters. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. 24 hours. Video and audio. Recording in progress. It was a legal boundary, a physical manifestation of the line that had been drawn. Only then did I turn to face them. They were staring at the sign, then at me. Roy's face was a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. "You won with a trick," he said. His voice was a low, guttural rasp, stripped of its former bluster. It was the sound of a man who had lost everything and was still trying to convince himself it was someone else's fault. I looked him directly in the eye. I felt nothing. No anger, no pity. Not even the cold satisfaction I had anticipated. There was only a great, vast emptiness where all of that used to be. "I won with the truth," I said. My voice was calm, a simple statement of fact. There was nothing else to say. The conversation, and our relationship, was over. I turned my back on them for the last time and walked up the 2 steps to my front door. I slid the new, heavy key into the lock. It turned smoothly, without a catch. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, into the cool, quiet air of my own home. I didn't look back. I closed the door. A solid weight of oak and steel. I turned the deadbolt. The sound of the heavy bolt sliding into the reinforced strike plate was not a click. It was a thunk, a deep, resonant, final sound. The sound of a vault being sealed. The sound of an ending. For a long moment, I just stood there in the entryway, my back against the door, listening to the silence. It was a different kind of silence now. It was peaceful. It was mine. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was an email from Mara Keene. The subject line read, "It's done." The body was brief, efficient, and everything I needed. "Nora, per the board's directive, our complete findings, including your original report and all corroborating evidence, have been formally transferred to the District Attorney's Office as of 3:45 p.m. today. They have already convened a grand jury. Helion Data's stock is down 28% in after-hours trading. Thank you. We couldn't have done it without you, Mara." I slipped the phone back into my pocket. It was over, on both fronts. I walked into the kitchen, The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The room was still empty, a blank canvas. I placed my car keys on the counter. Then I took the single house key from my pocket and set it down beside them. It looked small, but its presence filled the room. It was a period at the end of a very long sentence. My hand reached out, and my fingertips brushed against the cool, smooth drywall of the kitchen wall. I traced a small, almost invisible line. It was the spot where a long, jagged crack had been. A fault line from the house settling that Roy had always promised to fix but never did. I had patched it, sanded it, and painted it myself. The wall was whole again. There would be no grand reunion, no tearful, 11th-hour apology on the porch, no cathartic screaming match. I realized in that moment that I didn't want one. Their apology would be worthless. Another self-serving transaction. Their presence in my life would be a poison. The only closure that mattered was the one I had just given myself. The click of the lock, the healing of the wall, the silence of the house. I had not just taken back a house, I had taken back my own peace. I opened a cabinet, took out a clean glass, and filled it with cold water from the tap. The simple domestic act felt profound. I took a long, slow drink. Then, I glanced at the small tablet on the counter that served as the monitor for my security system. The screen showed the live feed from the front porch. It was empty. The sidewalk was empty. The street was empty. They were gone. As I watched, a small notification popped up in the corner of the screen. The system, having detected and recorded their presence and departure, had automatically saved the file. A new name appeared in the digital log. File name, home closed. The end. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. So please drop a comment below, and let's connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a thumbs up. To help this story be heard by more people, please also support it by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world.